Officer Brent Doherty hit the curb hard enough to jolt his cruiser's dashcam loose in its mount. The red and blue wash of his light bar smeared across wet asphalt and the black glass of the courthouse annex. He saw the man before he saw the reason. Tall, black, mid-30s, coat collar up against the cold. A leather briefcase in his left hand, phone in his right. The man moved with purpose, not panic. Not running, not hiding, just walking like he belonged to every inch of the sidewalk.
Dougherty's door slammed open.
His boots splashed through a shallow puddle. "Hey!" he barked, voice already sharpened by a long shift and a short fuse. "Stop right there. Hands where I can see them." The man paused. He turned slowly. The streetlight caught his face. Calm eyes, a tight jaw, a faint line of fatigue between his brows. He lifted his empty hand, palm out, and kept the phone low at his side. "Officer," the man said, even tone.
"No tremor."
"What's going on?" "What's going on is you're matching a suspect description," Doherty snapped, closing the distance fast. He didn't have a description. Not a real one. He had a call. Suspicious mail near the annex after hours. He had a dispatcher who sounded bored and a supervisor who liked stats. He had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. The man's briefcase hung steady, the leather dark and expensive. Doherty's eyes locked onto it like it was a weapon. "Put the bag down." Slowly. "It's a briefcase," the man said. "I'm leaving the building. I have identification. If you tell me what you need." Doherty's hand clamped around the man's wrist before the sentence finished. The grip was hard, dominating, a statement more than a restraint. "Don't talk," Doherty hissed. "Don't argue. You people always want to argue." The man's body tightened. His shoulders squared, controlled instinct fighting the humiliation of being handled. His phone slipped in his grasp as Doherty twisted his arm behind him. "Sir," the man said, voice lower now, warning threaded through restraint. "You're hurting me. Let go. This is unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" Doherty laughed once, short, ugly. "Unnecessary is you creeping around the courthouse at night with a bag like that. You think the rules don't apply to you?" The man's face flickered. Not fear. Calculations. He angled his head just enough to keep Doherty in view. "I'm authorized to be here," he said. "You're making a mistake." That did it. The word mistake. The implied insult. The suggestion that Doherty badge gun power could be wrong. Doherty shoved him forward. Hard. The man stumbled one step. The briefcase swung. Doherty seized on the motion as permission. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," the man said through clenched teeth, trying to keep his balance, trying not to fall. Doherty kicked the man's heel out from under him and drove his shoulder into the man's back. The impact slammed ribs into pavement. Air whooshed out. The phone skittered away, spinning until it hit the curb with a soft plastic crack. Doherty dropped to a knee, grinding down, pinning the man's cheek to the cold grit. One hand yanked the man's arm up, the shoulder joint forced toward its limit. "Hands behind your back," Doherty shouted, loud enough for the empty street to hear, loud enough to make it true. The man's breath came in sharp slices. His voice stayed controlled, but a seam of pain opened in it. "Officer, stop," he said. "You're going to dislocate." Doherty pressed harder. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to play games." Across the street, the annex doors opened. Light spilled out, bright and sterile. 2 court security officers stepped into the frame, both in dark uniforms with gold badges on their chests, both startled by the scene. One raised a hand. "Hey!" the older one called. "What are you doing?" Doherty didn't look up. He raised his voice to drown them. "Police business. Stay back." The younger security officer took a step forward anyway, eyes wide. He was close enough now to see the man's face pressed to the ground. "Officer, that's..." Doherty shifted his weight and the man's mouth scraped asphalt. Blood appeared at the edge of his lip, bright against dark skin. The man went still for one breath. Then his voice came again, quieter, aimed directly at Doherty's ear. "Your body camera is on," he said. "And so is the courthouse footage. Doherty's jaw tightened. His knee ground down like punishment. You threatening me? He demanded. No, the man said. I'm warning you. Something about the word warning landed differently. Not pleading. Not bargaining. A straight statement like someone accustomed to issuing them. Doherty fumbled for the cuffs. Metal clacking. Posture rigid with adrenaline. He forced the man's wrists together and snapped the cuffs shut too tight. The ratchet teeth biting skin. The man sucked in air through his teeth but didn't cry out. He turned his head as much as the pavement allowed and looked past Doherty toward the annex doors. The older security officer had moved closer, hands up, trying to de-escalate without making himself a target. Officer, he called again, voice firm but cautious. Who is that? Doherty finally lifted his head. His eyes were wild with righteous irritation, like the world was interfering with his authority. Doesn't matter, he spat. He's detained. Detained for what? The security officer asked. Suspicious activity, Doherty said, as if the phrase alone was a statute. The man on the ground exhaled slowly, controlling pain, controlling anger. He spoke toward the security officers, not Doherty. Officer, he said, then paused, as if measuring how to say it without escalating violence further. Please get Sergeant Mendez from the courthouse unit. Now. Doherty's head snapped back down. Don't you give orders, he growled. The man's gaze didn't break. It's not an order, he said. It's a request for everyone's safety. Doherty dragged him up by the cuffs. The man's shoulders jolted. His face tightened, but he stood, refusing to give Doherty the satisfaction of collapse. The cuffs were behind his back. His briefcase lay on its side with papers visible in the cracked seam. Doherty shoved him toward the cruiser. Walk. The man walked. There was a kind of quiet dignity in it that made the scene feel wronger than any shouting could. Even in cuffs, he moved like a man who knew the ground under him, like he had walked these halls and sidewalks with responsibility on his shoulders that went beyond one officer's temper. The younger security officer's face had gone pale. He stared at the briefcase, at the man's coat, at the building behind them, as if pieces were trying to assemble into an image he didn't want to recognize. The older one spoke into his radio, voice tight. Courthouse unit, we need Sergeant Mendez at the annex entrance. Now. Police detainment in progress. Doherty heard it and sneered. Call whoever you want, he said to the man as he opened the cruiser's rear door. They can pick you up from booking. The man angled his head just enough to meet Doherty's eyes. Booking will be difficult, he said softly, because you don't have probable cause. Doherty shoved him into the seat. The man's shoulder hit the door frame. Pain flared. He swallowed it. The door slammed shut. For a moment, the cruiser's interior turned everything into muffled echoes. Doherty's boots outside, distant radio chatter, the steady tick of the engine cooling. The man breathed carefully through his nose. Blood had dried at his lip. His cheek burned from the scrape. He tilted his head toward the tiny perforations of the partition, speaking so the microphone would catch it. Officer Doherty, he said, voice measured. State your reason for detaining me. Outside, Doherty froze. He had been reaching for the front door handle. The man's voice came through the cruiser's recording system, clean as a deposition question. Doherty turned slowly and looked back at the rear window as if the glass itself had betrayed him. The man continued, calm. For the record. Doherty's face tightened. His hand went to his radio. Dispatch. Run me a check, he said, trying to sound normal. I got a male detained at the courthouse annex. Need ID. He yanked the briefcase open without asking, spreading its contents across the trunk. A thick folder stamped with federal seals, a court calendar, a sealed envelope marked under seal, and a leather wallet. He flipped it open and pulled out an ID. The badge in the wallet wasn't a police badge. It was federal. It wasn't law enforcement either. It was the kind of credential most people only saw on television, the kind with weight behind it. The name underneath was crisp.
Hon. Marcus L. Hargrove.
United States District Judge. Doherty blinked once, then again. His mouth opened slightly, as if he could unsee it by breathing differently. The older security officer crossed the street now, faster, no longer cautious. The younger one followed, eyes locked on the wallet. Doherty's voice went sharp, defensive. "This could be fake," he said immediately, loud enough for them to hear. "People carry fake IDs all the time." The older security officer didn't even look at Doherty. He looked at the credential. His posture changed, spine straight, chin lifting in recognition that felt almost like fear. "Officer," he said, voice suddenly careful. "That's Judge Hargrove." Doherty's heart hammered once. Hard. He snapped the wallet shut as if it had burned him. "I don't know who that is," he said, but it came out too fast, too thin. The younger security officer swallowed. "He's on the federal bench," he said. He's the one who signed the injunction last month. He came through the annex earlier. We logged him in." Doherty's eyes flicked to the annex security camera mounted over the doorway. Its black dome angled down like a silent witness. The camera saw everything. It saw hands. It saw knees. It saw the way Doherty's body had moved with certainty, like he could rewrite reality with force. From inside the cruiser, the judge's voice came again through the partition. "Officer," he said, still calm, "open the door. Remove the cuffs." The words were simple. They carried no threat, and that made them heavier. Doherty's throat worked. He glanced at the security officers, searching for backup, for someone to tell him it was fine, it was nothing, it could be smoothed over. The older officer's face was rigid now. "Get him out," he said. "Now." Doherty's pride flared. "I'm still the arresting officer," he snapped. He was acting suspicious. He refused commands. The older security officer stepped closer, voice cutting. "He asked for Sergeant Mendez. You slammed him on the pavement." Doherty's eyes hardened. He took a step toward the security officer as if to reclaim authority through intimidation. "You want to tell me how to do my job?" The younger security officer lifted his radio, hands shaking. "Sergeant Mendez is on his way," he said quietly. And the annex supervisor. "And the U.S. Marshal Service has a post in the building." At the mention of marshals, the air changed. Federal. Consequences. A line Doherty couldn't bully his way across. Doherty forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Marshals? For what? I got a guy in the back of my cruiser. That's it." From inside, Judge Hargrove's voice returned. Not louder, just steadier. "It won't be a guy much longer," he said. "It will be evidence." The word evidence landed like a gavel strike. Footsteps approached, fast, heavy. The annex door swung open again and a woman in a courthouse sergeant's uniform stepped out. Hair pulled tight, eyes scanning, taking in the scene in one sweep. Sergeant Mendez. She was built like someone who had spent her career breaking up fights before they started. Her gaze locked on the cruiser, then the scattered papers on Doherty's trunk, then the federal credential. "What happened?" she demanded. Doherty straightened, smoothing his voice into authority. "Suspicious subject," he said. "Refused to comply. I detained him for investigation." Mendez's eyes narrowed. She picked up the credential with 2 fingers, reading it. "Judge Hargrove," she said, and there was no question in it. Doherty's lips pressed into a line. He didn't answer. Mendez looked at the security officers. Did he resist? The older one shook his head once. He tried to talk. He asked why. Officer Doherty grabbed him and slammed him. Mendez's jaw tightened. She moved to the rear door of the cruiser and looked through the window. Her expression shifted. She saw the judge's scraped cheek, the blood, the forced stillness. She opened the door. Judge Hargrove turned his head toward her, slow and controlled. His eyes were clear, not dazed, not confused, just focused. "Sergeant Mendez," he said. He knew her name. That alone was a quiet statement of who he was. Mendez's voice softened a fraction. "Your Honor, are you injured?" "My shoulder," he said, "and my wrists. The cuffs are too tight." Mendez looked at Doherty, and her tone hardened into steel. "Get the key," she said. Doherty hesitated. The pause was small. It was still a refusal. Mendez stepped toward him. Now. Doherty's face flushed. He reached into his belt, pulled the cuff key, and handed it over like it cost him something. Mendez unlocked the cuffs carefully. The judge flexed his wrists slowly. Angry red welts ringed them. He rolled his shoulder once. Pain flashed, but he didn't show it beyond a brief tightening around his eyes. As soon as he was free, he slid out of the cruiser. He stood, adjusting his coat, not to look composed, but because it was the only way to keep himself steady after being treated like an object. Doherty watched, jaw set, trying to recover. "You're free to go," he said abruptly, like granting freedom could erase what happened. "Misunderstanding. You can file a complaint if you—" Judge Hargrove looked at him. The streetlight reflected off the judge's scraped cheek. His voice came low and even. "This is not a complaint," he said. "This is an incident." Mendez cleared her throat. "Your Honor, we can escort you back inside. Medical." Judge Hargrove lifted one hand, a small stop gesture. His gaze stayed on Doherty. "Officer Doherty," he said, "did you activate your body camera?" Doherty's mouth opened. He looked away for half a second, then back. "It activates automatically," he said. "It does," Mendez said, voice flat. "And it's recording." Judge Hargrove nodded once. Slow. "And your dashcam?" he asked. Doherty's eyes flicked to the crooked mount inside the cruiser. "It's on," he muttered. Judge Hargrove's phone lay near the curb. Screen cracked. The younger security officer hurried to retrieve it, holding it out with both hands like an offering. "Your Honor," he said, voice shaky. Judge Hargrove accepted it, turned it over. The screen was spiderwebbed but still lit. He tapped it once. A recording timer was running. Audio waveform pulsed. He looked back at Doherty. "And my phone," he said, "was recording too." Doherty's face drained in real time. His eyes sharpened, calculating again, but this time the calculation was survival. "That's illegal," he blurted. "You can't?" "In this state," Judge Hargrove said, tone unchanging, "it is legal to record public interactions, especially with police. You should know the law you enforce." Silence stretched. Wet air. The low hum of the annex ventilation. Mendez swallowed hard. She recognized the moment for what it was. A line crossed, and no way back. The annex door opened again. Two men stepped out in suits with the posture of quiet authority. Behind them came uniforms that didn't belong to city police. Tan shirts, dark slacks, badges that caught the light. Deputy U.S. Marshals. One of the suited men approached with purpose. He was older, gray at the temples, eyes sharp. "Judge Hargrove," he said, voice controlled. "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephen Lyle. We were notified." Judge Hargrove nodded, the smallest motion. "I want medical documentation," he said. "Photographs. And I want a record of this officer's use of force, his stop justification, and his body camera footage preserved immediately." Lyle's gaze flicked to Doherty. It was the look of a prosecutor seeing a file open in his mind. "Yes, Your Honor," Lyle said. "We'll issue preservation notices right now." One of the marshals stepped closer, a woman with a calm face and hands that never left the open space near her belt. "Sir," she said to Doherty, "I'm going to need you to step away from your vehicle." Doherty's chin lifted. The reflex to resist authority, any authority, flared. "I'm a city officer," he said. "You don't tell me." The marshal's eyes didn't change. "Step away," she repeated, and there was no anger in it, only inevitability. Doherty took a half step back, then another, as if the air itself had pushed him. Judge Hargrove's voice lowered, slower now. "Officer Doherty," he said, "how many times have you done this?" Doherty's lips tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Judge Hargrove's gaze stayed steady. "Not to me," he clarified. "To people who didn't have a badge in a wallet. To people who didn't have colleagues inside a courthouse. To people whose bruises never became exhibits." The older security officer looked down, guilt flickering in his face, as if he could see the ghosts of past nights in the wet pavement. Doherty's voice snapped. I follow procedure. Judge Hargrove tilted his head slightly. Procedure, he echoed, and the word sounded like it carried weight and rot at the same time. Then you won't mind when procedure follows you. Lyle stepped in, voice calm, professional. Officer Doherty, he said, do you have a supervisor en route? Doherty's hand went to his radio by instinct, but he didn't key it. He didn't want witnesses. Mendez answered instead. City Sergeant is on his way, and Internal Affairs will be notified. The marshal woman turned her head toward another marshal. Secure the dashcam footage, she said, and the body cam upload. Doherty's eyes widened. You can't seize. The other marshal's voice cut through, polite and deadly. We're not seizing, he said. We're preserving. There's a difference. You should know that too. The street wasn't empty anymore. A car slowed near the intersection, headlights sweeping. A pedestrian across the way stopped. Phone raised. Someone whispered. The idea of the scene began to spread, invisible but fast. Judge Hargrove's shoulder throbbed. He could feel it with every breath now. He kept his posture anyway. Sergeant Mendez, he said. I want the annex footage preserved. All angles. No gaps. No missing time. Mendez nodded, already speaking into her radio. Annex control, lock the footage, she ordered. Export immediately. Preserve chain of custody. Do not overwrite. Doherty stared as the world moved without his permission. He had always been the one who moved it. Now it moved around him, leaving him behind. A city patrol supervisor arrived, Lieutenant Parker, stepping out of his vehicle with hurried authority, eyes scanning for a narrative he could contain. He took in the marshals, the suits, the courthouse sergeant, and his officer standing, rigid beside the cruiser. Lieutenant Parker, Mendez said sharply. Your officer assaulted a federal judge. Parker's face twitched. Assaulted what? Judge Hargrove stepped forward, meeting Parker's eyes with the same calm. I am Judge Marcus Hargrove, he said. Your officer slammed me to the pavement without probable cause, cuffed me, and searched my belongings. Your department will cooperate fully. Parker's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes flicked to Doherty, then away. He could smell catastrophe the way a firefighter smelled smoke. Sir, Parker said finally, voice strained. I'm
sorry.
We'll address. Judge Hargrove lifted a hand again, stopping the apology midair. Address it publicly, he said. And legally. Not quietly. The words weren't loud. They were final. The marshals moved with practiced coordination. One photographed the judge's wrists. Another documented the scrape on his cheek. Lyle requested Doherty's body camera footage through formal channels, voice comm, pen moving across a notepad. Doherty's breathing quickened. His hands flexed. The impulse to take control, to bark orders, to force the world back into alignment, rose like bile. He stepped toward Judge Hargrove, eyes hard. This is ridiculous, he said, voice low but fierce. You're trying to ruin my career over a simple stop. Judge Hargrove looked at him. His voice dropped even lower. You ruined it, he said, when you decided my body was a problem you could solve with the ground. Parker grabbed Doherty's elbow, pulling him back. Enough, he hissed under his breath. Shut up. Doherty jerked his arm away. He was suspicious. Parker's eyes flashed. He's a federal judge. Doherty's face contorted, anger and fear mixing into something uglier. So what? He said, and the words slipped out before he could stop them. He stopped. He realized too late that everyone heard the unfinished sentence, and everyone could imagine the ending. Judge Hargrove's eyes didn't change, but something in the air grew colder. Lyle looked up from his notes. Officer, he said, were you aware the annex was in active use tonight? Doherty glared. I got a call. What call? Lyle asked. From who? Doherty hesitated again. The pauses were stacking up like lies. Parker turned sharply toward dispatch on his radio. Dispatch, he said, voice clipped. I need the CAD record and 911 audio for the call that initiated this stop. Now. The response crackled back. Copy. Stand by. Judge Hargrove shifted his shoulders slightly. Pain pulsed. He breathed through it. His gaze drifted to his briefcase. Papers scattered. Mendez had gathered them carefully, restacking sealed envelopes, smoothing wrinkled edges as if the documents themselves deserved respect. She handed the briefcase back. Judge Hargrove accepted it and held it with his left hand, the right arm still stiff. I was here, he said quietly, because the annex holds restricted filings. I came to review a sealed motion. Lyle's eyes narrowed. What motion, Your Honor? Judge Hargrove didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved past Doherty to the courthouse, to the dark windows, to the inside machinery of law. He spoke finally, each word placed like a weight. A motion involving civil rights violations, he said. Patterns of unlawful stops, excessive force, evidence-planting allegations, and a request for federal oversight. Parker's face went still. The marshals exchanged a glance. Doherty's eyes widened. He swallowed. That's not my problem. Judge Hargrove's voice stayed even. It is now, he said. Dispatch crackled again. Lieutenant, we have the 911 audio. Caller was anonymous. No name. Number blocked. Lyle exhaled slowly, like the puzzle pieces were snapping into place. Anonymous call, he repeated. Convenient. Parker's face tightened. He looked at Doherty with a new kind of horror, not just at what he'd done, but at how easily the system had fed him the chance. The pedestrian across the street had started recording openly now. Another car slowed. Someone's voice carried on the cold air. Is that a judge? The night began to change shape, from a private abuse into a public event. Judge Hargrove turned toward Lyle. I want a formal referral to the Civil Rights Division, he said. Tonight. Lyle nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hargrove looked at Parker. And I want Officer Doherty removed from duty, he said. Now. Not tomorrow. Not after paperwork. Now. Parker swallowed hard. I can place him on administrative leave pending investigation. Judge Hargrove's gaze didn't blink. Do it, he said. Parker turned to Doherty, voice strained. Brent, he said. Hand over your service weapon. Badge. Camera. Doherty's face went red. You can't do that. Parker's voice cracked into authority. You're ordered. Doherty's eyes darted around marshals, courthouse, phones, cameras. There was no corner left to bully. No person left to intimidate. The power he'd lived on had become a cage. His hand hovered near his holster. For one dangerous half-second, the tension sharpened. The marshals shifted their weight, subtle but ready. Mendez's voice went low. Don't, she said, aimed at Doherty like a final warning. Doherty's hand trembled. He unclipped the holster strap, drew the weapon out carefully, and held it grip first toward Parker as if it were an insult. Then he stripped off his badge, the metal catching the streetlight before it vanished into Parker's palm. The body camera followed, unclipped with stiff fingers. Parker exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for minutes. He stepped back, radioing. Internal Affairs, he said, voice tight. I need an investigator and evidence techs at the courthouse annex. Officer involved in use of force on a federal judge. The words traveled outward instantly. Internal channels. Federal channels. News channels soon. Judge Hargrove leaned slightly against the edge of the trunk for one moment, just enough to let the pain settle. Lyle noticed and spoke softly. Your Honor, medical is on the way. Judge Hargrove nodded. His gaze stayed fixed on Doherty, who now stood empty-handed. No badge, no gun, no camera, stripped down to a man in uniform with nothing left to hide behind. Doherty's voice came out raw. This is insane, he said. You're making it into something it's not. Judge Hargrove's voice softened, but only because it no longer needed force. It was always something, he said. It just usually happened where no one important could see. The ambulances arrived with their harsh white lights. Paramedics approached, gloved hands gentle on the judge's shoulder. asking questions. Judge Hargrove answered without drama, but his eyes never left the circle of authority forming around the event. An internal affairs investigator arrived, suit and tie under a heavy coat, eyes sharp. Evidence technicians followed, bagging and tagging, documenting everything. A city captain showed up, face pale. A reporter's van rolled up at the far end of the block, drawn by scanner chatter. By dawn, the footage was already everywhere. The clip started with Doherty's lights flashing, his voice aggressive, his hands fast, his knee on a man's back. The audio caught every word. "You people always want to argue." It caught the judge's calm warning about cameras. It caught the moment Doherty called resisting when there was nothing to resist. By mid-morning, the judge's name was trending across the city. The courthouse released a statement confirming the incident. The police department released a statement about an ongoing investigation. But the footage didn't care about careful phrasing. The footage spoke in the language of bodies and pavement. Internal Affairs opened a formal case within hours. The city's Civilian Oversight Board announced an emergency session. The U.S. Attorney's Office requested records beyond that night. Doherty's stop history, use of force reports, citizen complaints, dismissed cases, and any arrests tied to his testimony. The pattern emerged like a bruise under skin. Slow at first, then undeniable. Complaints that had been not sustained. Videos that had malfunctioned. Witnesses who had failed to appear. A cluster of cases where evidence was found in pockets after aggressive takedowns. A line of people who had tried to file reports and been told it wouldn't matter. Now it mattered. 2 days later, the first warrant was served, not against Doherty, but against the department's evidence room systems. Federal agents, quiet and relentless, arrived with a court order signed by Judge Hargrove himself, recusing where necessary but ensuring the process had the authority it required. The order demanded preservation of digital logs, chain of custody records, and body camera archives. The department's union held a press conference. Their spokesman spoke about split-second decisions and dangerous streets. Behind him, the footage played in everyone's mind. An empty sidewalk, a briefcase, a calm voice, a knee grinding into a man's back. A week later, the Civil Rights Division announced a formal investigation into the city police department. The words were precise. Pattern or practice. Unconstitutional policing. Supervisory failures. Misconduct. The systemic fallout began to spread beyond Doherty. Supervisors who had signed off on reports were questioned. Dispatch protocols were audited. Anonymous tip patterns were traced. The department's complaint intake process was examined, and the quiet graveyard of ignored paperwork was brought into light. And then came the arrests, not the dramatic kind with sirens, but the quiet ones that carried weight. A detective from the same precinct was charged with falsifying reports. An evidence technician was placed under investigation for tampering. A supervisor was suspended for retaliating against a whistleblower. Doherty sat at home under suspension, staring at his phone as it rang and rang. Union rep, reporters, former friends. His name became a symbol not of policing, but of what policing had been allowed to become. When he finally returned to the public eye, it was not in uniform. It was in a courtroom. The hearing room was packed. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, a tight, suffocating atmosphere that smelled like paper and consequence. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses like unblinking eyes. The judge on the bench that day was not Hargrove. Another federal judge presided to avoid conflict, but Hargrove sat at a table in the front row, shoulder still in a brace, his cheek healed but faintly marked. Doherty entered in a suit that didn't fit right. He looked smaller without the belt and badge. His hands were empty. His eyes were restless, searching the room for sympathy and finding only attention. The prosecutor stood, voice steady. "Officer Brent Doherty," she said, "is charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, assault, and filing false reports. The government will show that the defendant used excessive force without legal justification, then attempted to conceal his misconduct behind false statements." Doherty's attorney rose with practiced outrage, speaking of political pressure and media frenzy. The words floated in the air and died under the weight of video evidence. When the footage played in court, the room went silent. The judge's body on the pavement, the knee, the cuffs, the words, the casual contempt. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth with her hand. A man shook his head slowly, tears standing in his eyes as if he recognized the scene in his own life, in his brother's, in his son's. Doherty sat rigid. His face twitched as if the screen had slapped him. Judge Hargrove was called as a witness. He stood, walked to the stand, and raised his right hand carefully because of the shoulder. He was sworn in. The prosecutor asked, "Your Honor, can you describe what happened?" Judge Hargrove's voice carried across the room with the calm authority of a man who had spent his life weighing words. "He stopped me," Hargrove said, "without explaining why. He grabbed me when I tried to speak. He forced me to the ground. He cuffed me and searched my belongings. He called me suspicious because I existed in the wrong place to him." The defense attorney stood, voice sharp. "Isn't it true," he said, "that you told the officer he was making a mistake?" "Yes," Judge Hargrove said. "And isn't it possible," the attorney pressed, "that your tone escalated the situation?" Judge Hargrove looked at him for a moment, then answered without irritation. "No," he said. "The officer escalated the situation when he decided my body was a threat. My tone did not put his knee on my back." A murmur moved through the courtroom like wind. The defense tried another angle. "You're a federal judge," he said. "You have power. Isn't it true you're using this to punish an officer?" Judge Hargrove's gaze stayed steady. "The law is not punishment," he said. "It is a boundary." He crossed it. The presiding judge leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed as if the answer had clarified something important. Later, the prosecutor called Sergeant Mendez. Then the security officers. Then the evidence tech who logged the annex footage. Then the expert who testified about use of force standards, shoulder injuries, and the difference between a lawful detention and a violent impulse dressed as procedure. Piece by piece, the narrative collapsed around Doherty until there was nothing left but what the cameras showed and what the bodies had endured. When the verdict came, it did not arrive with theatrics. The jury foreperson stood, voice trembling. "On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law," she said, "we find the defendant guilty." A sound escaped somewhere in the gallery. A sharp inhale, like someone had been underwater too long. More counts followed. More guilty. Doherty's shoulders sagged. His eyes fixed on nothing. His attorney touched his arm and whispered, but Doherty didn't move. At sentencing, the presiding judge spoke slowly, each word heavy, designed to be carried into history. "This court has heard countless cases involving abuse of power," the judge said, "but few have been as clear as this. The defendant used his badge as a weapon and then attempted to hide behind it. The harm done extends beyond one victim. It erodes trust, teaches fear. It tells a community that the law is not for them." Doherty stood when ordered to stand. His hands trembled at his sides. The judge's voice did not soften. "This is a federal conviction," the judge said. "You will never again serve as a law enforcement officer. You will be sentenced to a term of imprisonment." The number landed like a door closing. It was not symbolic. It was years. As marshals moved toward him, Doherty's face twisted, and his voice broke. "This isn't fair," he said, almost a whisper, almost childlike in its shock. "I was just doing my job." The judge looked down from the bench. "No," he said. "You were doing what you wanted." The handcuffs clicked around Doherty's wrists. Real cuffs this time. Not the too-tight performance of an arrest, but the measured restraint of consequence. The sound was small. It echoed. Anyway, outside the courthouse, people had gathered. Some held signs. Some held their phones. Some just stood with arms crossed, watching a system finally admit what it had denied. Judge Hargrove exited through a side door with security. The air was cold again, but it felt different. Cleaner. Or maybe it was just the quiet after a storm. On the steps, a woman approached him. Middle-aged, tired eyes, hands clenched around a folder. "Your Honor," she said, voice shaking. My son, 2 years ago, same officer. He said my son reached for something. He didn't. They said the camera malfunctioned. Judge Hargrove looked at her folder, then at her face. What's your son's name? He asked. She told him. The name hung between them like a weight. Judge Hargrove nodded once. Give that to the U.S. Attorney's Victim Witness Office, he said. Make sure they connect you with the investigation team. Tears spilled down the woman's cheeks, silent and unstoppable. She nodded, clutching the folder tighter, like it was suddenly a lifeline instead of a dead end. Behind her, others stepped forward with stories that had never been believed. A man with a scar on his forehead. A teenager with his mother's hand on his shoulder. A grandmother who spoke of a grandchild arrested on a corner for nothing but being there. The community didn't celebrate with joy. There was no clean happiness in it. There was only a grim relief, like pressure finally released from a wound that had been ignored too long. Weeks turned into months. The federal investigation widened. A consent decree was negotiated. Policies changed on paper and, under supervision, began to change in practice. Body camera audits became routine. Complaint investigations became transparent. Officers with histories of misconduct were removed. Training shifted. Oversight became real because it had to. None of it erased the years of harm, but it changed the direction of the road. Judge Hargrove returned to the bench after medical leave. His shoulder healed slowly, leaving a stiffness that reminded him every day of the pavement's cold truth. In chambers, late at night, he reviewed filings that told stories of human beings ground down by power. He read them with the patience of a man who understood what it felt like to have breath knocked out of him for asking why. One evening, after a long docket, he stood at his office window and watched the city lights flicker. Below, people moved through streets that still carried danger, still carried injustice, but now carried something else too. Memory turned into record, record turned into consequence. He touched the faint mark on his cheek, not because it hurt anymore but because it existed. In the end, the force that had slammed him to the ground did not disappear into paperwork. It did not vanish behind a closed door. It met a system that could no longer pretend not to see. And in the quiet after verdicts and headlines, in the steady rhythm of court calendars and reform orders, the city learned a hard lesson written in handcuff marks and preserved footage. Power could be used to harm, but it could also be used to hold the powerful accountable. Once the truth was forced into the light and made impossible to ignore.